All right, folks, we're back for another edition of Your Week in Review. I am Will Folks, the owner, founding editor of FITSNews.com. Another special edition of the show this week. We're doing things a little bit differently. I am down in our studios in Columbia, South Carolina, and on location in Greenville County, South Carolina, our research director, Jen Wood, and special projects director, Dylan Nolan. Now, Jen and Dylan have spent the last 2 weeks covering arguably the most complicated, convoluted, and graphic murder that FITSNews has ever covered, the Rose Petal murder. And we got a decision, guys. Jen, I want to start with you. Were you surprised that the jury voted that Zach Hughes was guilty of this crime?
Ultimately, no, I was not surprised.
All right, tell me why.
We'll talk about this, but when he took the stand in his own defense, describing basically admitted to murdering Christina Parcell, I think it was difficult testimony for the jurors to listen to. And I also think, well, you could get there on his motive. He was a little bit dispassionate about what he was describing.
You mean the 35 stab wounds inflicted on the victim, Christina Parcell, in this savage attack back in October 2021, Jen?
Yep, that's exactly what I'm referring to.
Right. He's almost antiseptic about talking about it. But
Right.
Let me ask the same question, Dylan, to you. Were you surprised that these were guilty verdicts returned against Zach Hughes?
I was not surprised. I don't know. I think that if you roll this over with 5 different juries, maybe 1 or 2 of them would have been hung, or I don't think any of them would have acquitted just because of how graphic the crime was and how dispassionate Zach was when he took the stand. As Jennifer mentioned, I think his flat affect was off-putting and just did not. I mean, it's not normal to kill another human being, especially if you don't have that personal relationship in the way that Zach stepped in. But I do think that some folks could have been convinced by the way that he stepped in and said the state is withholding evidence, because the reality is we all have cell phones. And I think that if they rolled this over and did this trial numerous times, some of them would have been hung juries. But was I surprised that this one delivered a guilty verdict? No, I was not.
Jen, let me ask you this question, and we're going to get into some of the details of this crazy story and the 2-week trial that you two have been following for the last 14 days. But Jen, let me ask you this question. If you had been seated on that jury up in Greenville County, would you have voted to convict Zach Hughes?
I would have.
Okay, tell me why.
I think for the same reason the jury did. I think the state did a really good job presenting their case, reminding the jury that Zach Hughes had stabbed a woman he had never met in his life 35 times. I do think the defense presented, given the hand they were dealt, they did a exceptionally good job putting what they were able to put in front of the jury. But the brutality of this murder was hard to get past.
Dylan, let me ask you the same question. Were you on that jury in Greenville County? Would you have voted to convict Zach Hughes?
I think that if I had been presented with the information that the jurors had, if I hadn't done any extracurricular research, I would have most definitely found Hughes guilty. If I went on my cell phone or watched television coverage and learned of the horrific things which Christina Parcell has been incredibly accused of doing after her death, the things that are currently holding Bradley Post in the Greenville County Detention Center awaiting trial for the charges brought by the Attorney General's office, I think that might be a different story.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because I want to get into what this jury saw, what they heard, what they were told not to consider in their deliberations. But let's talk about this a little bit first. The gruesome crime scene, and again, rose petals sprinkled around the body of Christina Parcell, who had just been brutally stabbed to death. We talked about those 35 wounds, 27 of them to the head and neck area, including stab wounds to the neck that literally severed both her carotid and jugular. Just a gruesome, savage killing. But when police arrived at this crime scene, they did not just find, this horrific, rose petal scene. They also found evidence of child sex abuse, child porn. We've had debates over what to call it, but this was found on the scene as well, and it was linked back to Parcells' fiance, a gentleman by the name of Bradley Post. And on those materials, there are allegations that Christina Parcell herself was participating in some of this child porn, child sex abuse involving her young daughter. That leads us to the father of the young girl, who was the victim of this alleged abuse, John Melo. And Melo figured prominently in this trial. And in fact, during Zach Hughes' testimony related to his interactions with John Melo, he was actually arrested by Greenville County Sheriff's deputies for his role in this, or his alleged role, let's say, in this murder. But Jen Wood, let me ask you this. Jurors heard this backstory in little snippets. They heard during Zach Hughes' testimony brief references to the state hiding sexual abuse, and they were told to disregard that. Jen, let me ask you this. Do you think they really were able to disregard it?
I think as a human, it's hard to disregard anything. I mean, I think the judge did a very good job providing curative instructions when it was mentioned, but yeah, you can't unring that bell in somebody's mind, especially when you're looking for a motive as to why somebody did something so horrible. Um, I like I said, it's just impossible to unring that bell.
Well, Dylan, let me ask you this question. Judge Patrick Fant, at the beginning of this trial, ruled that the child sex abuse materials, the child porn, would be inadmissible. And he stuck to that ruling throughout the trial. And in fact, when Zach Hughes on multiple occasions referenced it, he was cited with a contempt charge, which earned him a 6-month sentence. Obviously, that's kind of irrelevant now, given the life sentence that was imposed on him after the guilty verdicts. But Dylan, did you agree with the decision by the judge to keep all of that material out of this trial?
It's interesting. Keeping the child sex abuse material out is one thing because, to everybody's account, nobody had any clue about that until after Christina Parcell's death. Keeping the child sex abuse out is a different thing because I think that is the basis of what John Mello was allegedly feeding to Zachary Hughes to get him to commit this crime. So when Judge Fant made this ruling that keeps child sexual abuse and child sexual abuse material out, I kept thinking multiple times throughout the trial, maybe these things should have been bifurcated. Maybe the child sexual abuse material, which led to post charges, should not have been allowed to go in front of the jury. But the child sexual abuse, which was documented multiple times in police reports, DSS reports, and ultimately not acted on by state actors until after Christina's death, should have been allowed to go before the jury because I think that's what led Zach to the house that day.
Well, Jen, let's talk about this a little bit. Dylan obviously adamantly convinced that this young child, the daughter of John Mello and Christina Parcell, had been sexually abused. Now, prosecutors prior to the trial told us that that was not the case, that it was only photographs and videos, and that there were no sex acts depicted in them. Obviously, that's still, by my definition, abuse, but certainly it would fall into the category of the child porn, child sex abuse materials, not necessarily sexual abuse. Jen.
Will, may I stop you there? Because there's an
Please.
interesting piece of information which you didn't know, which nobody knows because this was not broadcasted. But the defense proffered testimony into the court records, which presumably we will be able to obtain once we get a transcript of this trial. But this record indicated that investigators had seen Christina digitally manipulating her child's genital region
Oh boy.
on these photos.
Jen, had you heard that?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that is the first I have heard that. Again, prior to the trial, we specifically...
Nobody heard this.
Well, and again, obviously the jury wouldn't based on the judge's order. But let's go back to the question of, we asked prosecutors that, and we're actually going to get Solicitor Walt Wilkins in the studio, or we're going to go to him next week at some point. We'll ask him about this. But we were told leading up to the trial that there were no founded sex abuse allegations involving the child. But Dylan, you're telling us different.
Yeah, I mean, DSS chose not to found those reports. Just because DSS wasn't incompetent doesn't mean that it wasn't happening.
Well, those were in the photos. Those were in the photos discovered after the murder.
Right, but I'm saying that DSS reasonably could have discovered that child abuse was happening just because by conducting a proper investigation, considering it was happening.
Conduct a proper investigation.
I don't know that they didn't.
Have you seen their investigation? Have you talked to them? Have you spoken to the guardian ad litem?
I have not spoken with these individuals, but it was happening.
It was happening. I have asked John Melo on numerous occasions. I mean, because he did claim this. He claimed it. He claimed it repeatedly. He claimed it with me. He made these allegations with police, with DSS, with the guardian ad litem. He made them with me. I asked him for help substantiating it because this child, if she was in danger as a human,
everybody wants to help her.
Everybody wants to help. When I asked for help substantiating it, I was threatened. I was not provided with any information that would lead me to be able to file a report to substantiate these allegations.
Right. And, it's unfortunate because there are kids that have parents who are complete nutballs, but it's incumbent upon DSS to be able to work through that situation.
So when you go into these allegations and you sit down and you try to substantiate them and you interview the child, you pull the child into a separate interview. I mean, what do you do to be able to substantiate that? It's hard. It is difficult. And I know these people are broken, that they miss this. This child was, I worry about this child. And I worry about our system.
I mean, her mother's been brutally murdered and clearly engaged in improper conduct at a minimum. I mean, at a minimum. And if Dylan's accurate, if the evidence in fact depicts abuse, that would be vastly elevated from what we were initially informed, which was that it was merely the child sex abuse material, not actual child sex abuse. But now, on top of that, her father is sitting in the Greenville County Detention Center where Zach Hughes was sitting for the last 3+ years. He was denied bond on charges that could earn him a life sentence for his proximity, and that was all due to the testimony of Zach Hughes, who claimed that Melo offered him first $5,000, then $10,000 to commit this murder. Let me ask you guys this. Zach Hughes and John Melo, before we entered this trial, there was tons of speculation about their connection. And I love the exchange you guys just had. I could sense a little tension there. Dylan, you sat down with John Melo. You sympathize with him a bit, don't you?
There are elements that you certainly sympathize with. Clearly, I sat down with him and his daughter. It's clearly a loving relationship there. John Melo, as Jennifer says, will try to use you as a member of the press to get his side of the story out. And if he doesn't feel like you're doing that, he will berate you. As I've said multiple times on this air, I can understand why these state officials, when interacting with him, were nonplussed, because he's a person who does not interact with somebody from the government like you or I would. That being said, his parental antennas that something horrifically wrong was going on with his daughter were correct. So of course I sympathize with that. Any parent who is trying to raise the red flag on something like that and tries to do the right thing over a course of years.
Well, hold on, Dylan. Dylan, I got to stop you there. Tries to do the right thing. Let's rewind that a little bit. I mean, the actions here that we're discussing, and I understand no one on this air is going to defend the South Carolina Department of Social Services. I mean, the agency, again, has been a disaster for decades. They had a guy in recently who was supposed to fix things. Clearly, credible instances of child abuse and neglect are falling through the cracks, but tried to do the right thing. I mean, I think this guy, the first time he received reports of this, leak them directly to the media. The second time, apparently, tries to get Zach Hughes to send these nude photographs from some escort website to neighbors. And then, again, tries to arrange basically a contract killing. Dylan, how's that doing the right thing, man?
Certainly, he did all sorts of things which are legitimately insane, which is why he's in jail right now and probably will be in prison for the remainder of his natural life if he indeed is convicted of the same sentence that Zach is, which the statute says that he can be for, accessory to this felony. That being said, I think that any parent has really good antennas for when something is going wrong with their child, and I will always sympathize with the parent who has their antennas go up for a good reason and tries, I get it. He's not a rational actor. He's clearly not a rational actor. But he identified something horrific going wrong with his daughter and he attempted to intervene legally. That failed. And then he intervened illegally. And now he's going to likely have a horrific time going through the legal system. And I'm not saying he didn't earn that. I mean, he seemingly arranged a contract killing if this evidence stands up in court.
Right. Well, Jen, let me put you on the spot a little bit too. We're talking about some of these efforts by Melo to go through the legitimate processes. And you were saying earlier that you'd reviewed some of these. And obviously we referenced the guardian ad litem in this case and her testimony about being threatened, et cetera. And you mentioned you yourself had been threatened by Melo. I've been on the receiving end of a few threats from John Melo as well. But Jen, let me ask you this. Was there not a record there that authorities, social workers should have acted on, or that the guardian should have acted on, no matter how crazy John Melo is?
I mean, in between these concerns about potential inappropriate contact with the mother and the fiance, we have a report of Christina giving the child over-the-counter cold medicine without consulting John. We have a report of Christina giving the child too many baths, which makes her eczema worse. We have a report of Christina taking her to a roller derby in which she witnessed brutal acts. We also have in there some other reports, her leaving the child with her father, who allegedly abused Christina as a child. Allegedly, there's no conviction, but I do think that that did come up in a deposition. I haven't seen the entire deposition. We have a report of the child witnessing her grandfather smelling sugar off the table through a straw, allegedly. We have a report of her testing positive on a drug screen after a visit from her mother. Now, that the drug screen she tested positive on was a private one that John Melo took her to get done, and DSS followed that up afterwards with their own drug screen, which came back negative. So there are some reports that were concerning, but they're all allegedly they were unable to substantiate them. And then we have the child has numerous injuries while in her mother's care, minor injuries while in her mother's care. So it's a lot of reports that they're weeding through, and a lot of them seem too many baths.
But it never
Too many
reached a
baths.
point of critical mass where action was taken.
Right.
Well, let's discuss this too. The daughter of John Melo and Christina Parcell, not the only alleged victim of this child sex abuse material production, or if you believe, the reference that Dylan made earlier, the child sex abuse, there was another young girl who actually is referenced in a civil lawsuit filed against Bradley Post and against the estate of the late Christina Parcell, alleging the same sort of behavior. And of course, Melo also apparently had received reports that his young daughter was sleeping in the same bed as Bradley Post and his former girlfriend, Christina Parcell. That certainly, as a dad, that would have been enough for me.
Right.
But
And they were all alleged to have been nude.
yeah. Well, as we look at this, guys, we're obviously two more trials are in the works here, because John Melo is facing charges of accessory before the fact and attempting to basically hire someone to commit a murder. We also have the charges against Bradley Post, multiple charges involving the child sex abuse materials that were found. Those will be handled by the Office of South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson. As these two separate prosecutions move forward, guys, how much clarity do you think we're going to get on the nature of these allegations? In other words, I guess what I'm going to ask is, which one of y'all is going to be right on the nature of these allegations that were leveled against Christina Parcell and Bradley Post?
Can I take it?
Please.
I think that Bradley Post will likely take a plea deal. In these types of cases, it is extremely uncommon for defendants to take them all the way to trial. It'll be interesting to see if the Office of Attorney General Alan Wilson offers a plea in this case. I would guess that they will. I would guess that they plea those 9 felonies down to some reduced charge. It will be interesting to see what that is, but that is pretty common in these cases, is to charge defendants with a lot of felonies so that you as a prosecutor then have leverages to negotiate a plea deal. John Melo, I doubt, just having spoken with him multiple times, that he will take a plea deal. I think that he will take this all the way to trial, and I think that he will likely go the way of Zach Hughes, in that he will attempt to take control of the courtroom, knowing that he has nothing to lose, and attempt to put as much on the record as he possibly can. There's a third avenue that you didn't mention, which I think will be very interesting, and that is the appeals process in this
Yeah.
case. I think that those filings, because they've had access to all the discovery, they know a lot more about what was found in that house than anybody else who has any motive to talk about it. I think we could see a lot of it exposed in the appeals process.
I agree. I also think in the process of John Mello's prosecution, I think that we are going to find out which of these allegations were real. What he sent to Zach Hughes, I I think we're going to find out a lot about these email addresses that the prosecution is saying was made up. Um, I've received, when the guardian ad litem was on the stand testifying about emails she had received, I had received a lot of emails from the
That
same.
sounded familiar to you
Yeah,
as
I was
well?
like, she forgot the name of one of them, and I was like, it's this, just in the back of the courtroom thinking, yep, got that one, got that one. I think we may find out a lot of what John Mello used to motivate Zach to brutally murder Christina Parcell was, in fact, John Mello, came from John, the email from the biker gang threatening him. I think that affidavit by the firefighter is certainly interesting, saying that Christina propositioned him at Hall's Steakhouse, that he got from posting a Craigslist ad seeking information about Christina. John Mello posted this ad on Craigslist, and this firefighter responded to the ad that, "Hey, yeah, this happened to me at Hall's Steakhouse." Well, the firefighter is not with us anymore. He died. So
I'm sorry, Jim. We also heard allegations of him attempting to convince people to lie on affidavits related to this case. But I want to ask, and Dylan, you've got your political hat on now. I hope you put your political hat on real quick. You mentioned Alan Wilson pleading this down, the possibility or probability that the Attorney General's office might plead this down. Dylan, do you think, given the current political environment with the Attorney General running for governor of South Carolina and his top rival in that race, Nancy Mace, challenging him on his prosecution of precisely these types of cases, or rather accusing him of not being sufficiently aggressive, could that play into this? I mean, this is arguably the highest profile child sex abuse case he's going to have. Can he really afford politically to plead it down?
That's interesting. She's obviously willing to hit him over absolutely nothing. She proved this in the will of Congress last week. Would she be willing to hit him over something that would make everybody angry? Of course. That being said, I think he'll argue a conviction's a conviction, and if he ends up putting Bradley Post away for 20 years, will folks really care that it didn't go to trial? I don't know. But if he doesn't get a significant prison sentence, should these allegations be true, I think folks will have a big problem with that, and he'll have a big political problem on his hands.
Yeah, no, you're Let me ask you guys this about the performance of the solicitor's office. Obviously, this was a huge case for 13th Circuit Solicitor Walt Wilkins. It comes from a very prestigious, politically influential South Carolina family. Both his father and uncle, very well known throughout the Palmetto State. This was a case where a lot was on the line for him. Uh, his opening statement, a lot of folks said it was a little too corny, didn't really hit the mark. Some folks were criticizing it. Also, when Zach Hughes came off the stand and he had the opportunity to cross-examine him, or rather right before he came off the stand, he asked only one question. And then obviously, Jen, you recapped his very emotional closing argument. Jen, let's start with you. How would you rate the performance of Walt Wilkins in this trial, the solicitor?
Um, it was up and down. Like I agreed with the opinion on his opening statement. Uh, but throughout the trial, I kept thinking, he's going to tie this together at the end with this closing argument, and he did. His closing argument, his performance was masterful. I thought the jury never took their eyes off of him. They were sitting upright in their seat. I thought, his inflection of his voice when it went up when it needed to, and it went down when it needed to. He hit key points very well. I thought he brought it home in the end, and the one question that he asked Zach Hughes, I was stunned, but, before you didn't see this on the live stream, but before he asked that question, he put a photo of Christina Parcells' body laying there, and that's the last thing the jury saw before they went to deliberate, and that was powerful, and I also think he knew how unpredictable Zach was, and he had nothing to lose. Nothing to lose at that point.
Yeah. Dylan, what do you think? How do you think Walt Wilkins acquitted himself during this trial?
First of all, I mean, the guy won the case, so you can't really criticize how he lawyered there. Uh, but let me take it down a different angle here. What if Zach Hughes' defense team had chosen to go after the case the solicitor's office presented instead of doing what I'm sure the client wanted to do, which was get on the stand and explain himself and justify what he did? I think that there is an outsized chance that we would either still be in trial or looking at a hung jury if they had gone point by point, and those two expert lawyers, some of the best that you can get, had gone after the evidence. That being said, by taking the stand, Zach made it the solicitor's office game to lose. I mean, he literally went up there and went up there and confessed to killing Christina Parcell. So that is already half of the crime proven. He's proven that he did it. Now all the solicitor's office has to do is convince these jurors that he did it with malice aforethought. And as you say, in that closing argument, I think Walt clearly made a compelling case that that was what happened.
Jen, you and I were talking about this case over the weekend. We talked about it a little bit more this week as the trial moved on, and you made a comment that was interesting to me. You said there are no winners in this story. What do you mean by that? And follow up, where do you think this story goes from here?
I mean, you walked out of court yesterday, and throughout, people are very, very bothered by Zach's father, David Hughes' statement prior to sentencing. But, in the courtroom throughout the past 2 weeks, what I saw was, loving family and friends, kind family and friends, people who cared about Zach, who were kind to us. They respected the boundaries between, Christina Parcells' family. They are clearly good people. He has been surrounded by love. Um and, walking out of there, listening to that press conference, what we ended up with in this situation is, um, a mother brutally murdered. Whether or not she's a sympathetic victim, clearly she isn't. She's complicated. Her sister broken. Her sister has been through hell and back. Zach's family broken, a talented pianist, an artist, going to prison for the rest of his life, a father going to jail and being tried for, this child. who- I mean, she's lost her mom, her dad. There are no winners. And I think that it's sad. It's really sad.
Dylan, where does it go from here in your estimation?
I think, Jennifer, you're completely right. I mean, this is like a Russian novel in that there's just no upside in the outcome of this story. There are no winners. Where does it go from here? I mean, the story continues. Zach will appeal. I don't know that that will go particularly well, but I'm not an attorney. I don't know if there are any issues raised on the appeal that potentially could get this to a new trial. But even if there is a new trial, I don't know that the outcome would be different. Obviously, 12 different jurors, it could be different.
And the defense approach could be different if you were to get a new trial.
But yes, I mean, the story is going to continue forward, but it's not like it's going to have some renewing aspect. I mean, the tragedy that you just so eloquently spoke of, that is this story. And it will continue to be this story. We can only hope that the girl can move past this in her adult life and have a, fulfilling life after this.
Well, for now, the story involves Zach Hughes on his way to the Kirkland Correctional Institute in Columbia, South Carolina, actually about 8 miles northwest of the capital in Columbia. That is the intake center for the South Carolina Department of Corrections. If you followed our Murdaugh murders coverage, you're familiar with it. That's where Alec Murdaugh was sent. And he will be subjected over the next month to a variety of tests as correction officials seek to identify and determine a permanent placement for him within the state's prison system. And then again, as we mentioned, 2 active trials that will be pending, one out of the 13th Circuit involving John Melo and the allegations against him connected to not only the murder of his ex-girlfriend and the mother of his child, but also the previous conspiracy and harassment allegations. Those are still pending against him, and Zach Hughes obviously convicted of those crimes along with the murder and the deadly weapon and the burglary charges in this trial. But guys, I want to ask you one last question before we go on this episode. And Jen, I want to start with you. This is a story FITSNews has been covering for years. We did an entire podcast series on it 2 years ago. We have been following it intimately through filings, through various detailed exposés on the key figures here. No one was paying attention to this story. And then at the last minute, the mainstream media kind of parachutes in. And again, don't want to dog them out. I think they did a great job covering it. And we, unlike some, welcome that kind of community coverage of stories like this. But Jen, are you surprised that this story took so long to catch hold?
I am kind of surprised. I'm glad it did because I do think it raises a lot of really good issues. I think it has the potential to make people pay attention, um, to make people approach situations like that child was in a little differently. Um, but I kept telling people, Kathy from Gossip Rumors and Innuendo, YouTube channel's been, she started following this case after she listened to our podcast, and he kept saying
And
it's coming.
Gigi at Law and Crime?
Yeah, Gigi at Law and Crime, who I adore, Seton Tucker. And, as soon as they started getting into it, they were like, whoa, this is wild. And I knew that the trial was going to be a little bit unhinged, for lack of a better word. Um, I think it could have been even more so if John Mello had been called to testify. Like, I keep thinking, like, you have no clue how unhinged this could have gotten. Um, but,
So you think the
Zach
judge
taking the
did a good
stand.
job keeping it on the rails?
Oh, I think, yes, absolutely. And I think, I see a lot of criticism of Judge Fant online, but what people didn't see, people did not see when the jury left the courtroom, and they didn't see that side of him. There was one objection, I think the big objection, when the CSAM material came up, and Walt Wilkins leapt out of his chair and objection, and He sent the jury out, and as soon as they got out, he looked at the courtroom. He's like, everybody take a breath, like breathe. And I
Yeah.
think, his consistent, calm demeanor, his friendliness towards everybody in the courtroom, and his very, very cautious review of legal issues was made all the difference in this trial. I think, he frequently told the defense and the prosecution when they had to take a second to review legal matters, take your time. There's no rush.
Right.
He would go into his chambers. He would take 15 minutes. He would take an hour if he had to review case law to make a decision. And I think that that was important in this case. And I think it's going to make all the difference throughout the appeal process.
Well, what an appeals process it's going to be. Dylan, let me ask you the same question. Are you surprised it took so long for this case to catch on, or was it just so complicated of a case? People had to wait to the trial to get some sense of clarity about what was going on.
It's funny. I was listening to the Court TV producers packing up their gear yesterday as this thing broke, and they were kind of panicking. They're like, oh man, this trial's over on Thursday. We don't have anything new starting until Monday. We got to figure out what to do on Friday. I think that until there is something on the docket, there's something scheduled, it doesn't really exist to these major networks. I was hearing their sound guy made a joke like, oh, let's go to some pretrial hearings, because apparently those are viewed as boring and nobody cares about them, in the network TV world.
And I love them.
Right. That's what we live for. This is where you get the details of these cases.
I was like, ooh, there's a pretrial motion. Yay.
Right. So I think I'm not surprised. I mean, you hear how these people talk about court cases. It is primetime television and not much else. Although I have to give the Court TV producer credit. At the press conference, she was the only one who was asking hard-hitting questions.
She asked the questions. I was like, every time she asked a question, I was like, that's where I was going.
Because the rest of us have to deal with Walt Wilkins and his solicitor's office for time immemorial. She gets to go fly back to wherever she's from and never see him again. So she can ask the hard-hitting questions.
Well, hey, he's agreed to sit down with us, so hopefully we'll ask him some of those hard-hitting questions too. But one thing I got to say to both of you guys who spent the last 2 weeks up there, you spent a lot longer than that on this case, particularly you, Jen, covering this thing in so much detail. And what I really respect about the two of you and why I'm so happy to work with you is I know you guys often felt tugged, maybe not in different directions, but at times in divergent directions as it related to this case. And I love the way that you guys not only got those opinions out as you have on this show, but worked together as professionals on this. And I tell you what, that is one reason that FITSNews, I think, in addition to covering these things from the very beginning and those hearings where you do get all that granular detail, our ability to be open to all perspectives, to hear all perspectives, I think that's what separates us from the pack. So I can't thank the two of you enough, not only for your hard work, but for exemplifying that professionalism and that willingness to see all the angles, even if you don't necessarily believe it yourself. So hats off to both of you. And folks, that is a wrap for this edition of Your Week in Review, another special edition on the Rose Petal murder. Once again, thank you to everyone who subscribes to our media outlet. Your subscriptions, folks, are what empower everything we do here, whether it's big true crime sagas like this or the daily grind of holding law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, politicians, you name it, accountable for their actions. We'll continue to do it. And if you value independent coverage focused on that accountability, please support us with a subscription. Again, only $8 a month over at FITSNews.com. And we will catch you next time on our Week in Review.